Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. We would like to welcome you to today's Azure webinar series, Simplify Kubernetes Deployment and Operations with AKS on Azure.
Great. Thanks so much, Pamela, and thanks everyone for joining us. A little bit about me before we dive in. So as Pamela mentioned, I'm the lead program manager for Azure Containers. And I also happen to represent Microsoft on the board of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where a lot of technology like Kubernetes is being sort of promoted and developed in the open in a open source cross-vendor sort of framework. I came to Microsoft about 6 months ago as part of the Deis acquisition, where I was a CTO and co-founder. And I'm an engineer by trade. I was an early contributor to the Docker project, did some work on Mesos and early work on Kubernetes as well. I should also mention I'm joined today as well by the lead for the AKS service, Jason Hansen. If you do have questions about the AKS roadmap, he's busily answering questions already. Feel free to post those into the Q&A, and if we have time at the end, we'll also have some opportunity for live Q&A. So want to get into just a little bit of overview here. So what are containers really, right? Well, containers in many ways are lighter weight virtual machines. Rather than virtualizing the operating system, you're virtualizing at the process level, which means you get to remove a lot of overhead, specifically around having to manage that guest operating system. Technology like Docker obviously has exploded in popularity, and containers are really taking over worldwide. I think everyone who's joined this call is probably well aware of that. Now, moving along here, the container orchestration market, the container market in general has lots of interesting use cases. I think the bulk of what we see in the wild is mainly around deploying common web applications, microservice architectures, and we're starting to see a lot more interest in things like batch execution, ETL jobs, continuous integration and deployment. Lots of benefits around this stuff, around portability, utilization, gains, the sort of operational model that these the container format provides is very enticing to a lot of folks. But there's still a big challenge, and that big challenge is around how you provision and manage a lot of this containerized infrastructure. Oftentimes, it's a lot more work than people are expecting. Now, that sort of brings us to the concept of container orchestration. When you have a lot of these containers, you often need to lay down some software, typically something like Kubernetes, that's going to give you a lot of features that are going to be required, things like zero downtime upgrades, maintaining more than one running replica of a piece of a software, a container, constructing batch workflows, or even things like container-to-container communication, service discovery, auto-scaling, things like that. So we really do see Kubernetes taking off as the container orchestrator of choice for people in the open source ecosystems. And a lot of that work is coming out of the CNCF, and customers are extremely interested in this. Lots of folks that I talk to, and we're excited to have launched at the end of October, our new AKS service. So this is, AKS is sort of the new rebranded version of Azure Container Service. Sorry, one moment here. And what is AKS really? Well, AKS is, simply put, it's your Kubernetes cluster, but it's fully managed by Azure. We have been in the market with a container service solution, sort of the first generation solution. And what we heard from folks is that they loved what we were doing in terms of ease of deployment, but they wanted a more managed experience, a more operations-friendly experience. And that's really what we're delivering with AKS. So why is this important? Why does this matter to you? Well, first of all, this is easy to use, right? We want to make this the fastest path to Kubernetes on Azure, and we've certainly achieved that. Up and running with 3 simple commands. I'll show that to you in a moment. We also want to make this easy to manage and operate, right? Things like automated upgrades, patching, scale up, scale down. The control plane is now self-healing, so if there are issues with the Kubernetes infrastructure, it will auto-recover from most of that. And most importantly, this uses these open source upstream Kubernetes APIs. This is not some Microsoft fork or flavor of Kubernetes. This is 100% pure Kubernetes, and that's important for people who are betting on open source technology like this. Now, to get started with AKS, it's incredibly easy. There's basically 3 commands you need to run. The first is AKS create, which will, you pass it a resource group, the name of your cluster, and some other optional parameters. And that will go and provision a cluster. It takes about, somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes, depending on which region you're in. The next is you'll use AKS install CLI. Download the kubectl command line client. If you're already using Kubernetes, you may already have this client. Don't, this is a handy tool to get it onto your workstation. Next, you'll call AKS get credentials. And what this will do is it will download the authentication file and place it into your home directory that will allow kubectl to talk to this remote cluster, configured automatically to talk to this remote cluster. And from there, you're up and running. 3 commands, and then kubectl get nodes or any other kubectl command for that matter will just work normally. Now, I do want to talk a bit about the management aspects of this, because we put a lot of work into making sure that not just that day 1 experience that I was showing you before, but really the day 2 and beyond experience is great. And one of the biggest problems we hear from customers is that upgrading Kubernetes, especially a Kubernetes cluster that's in production, is one of the hardest parts about maintaining these environments over time. And so what we've done here is we've taken all of that manual work involved in upgrading a cluster, and we've wrapped it up in this one command, AKS upgrade. And what this does is it will do a very graceful rolling update of the Kubernetes control plane, as well as all of the Kubernetes nodes, by cordoning and draining all of those nodes and making sure they're sort of ready. This upgrade procedure is, for people who've had to do this, by hand, you'll really appreciate how much work has gone into making this a streamlined, smooth process, and we're really excited about offering this feature to customers. Now, AKS scale is equally interesting. This is going to allow you to sort of manually scale your cluster up and down by specifying the target agent count that you want for this. Now, when we scale up, that's relatively simple and straightforward. We wait for the nodes to become ready, and then we return from the command. On scale down, we have to make sure that we are cordoning and draining those nodes as well to make sure that we can gracefully migrate workloads to other nodes in the cluster. To ensure that application uptime is respected. Now, I want to be clear that Kubernetes without AKS, so for example, if you're using ACS today or ACS Engine, or frankly Kubernetes on any other provider, your infrastructure is going to look something like this. You're going to have a control plane with a series of master nodes associated with it. Then you're going to have an agent pool with a series of agent nodes inside of it. And what's interesting and tricky about this is that those master VMs require a lot of care and feeding. You have to update them. You have to patch them. You have to, worry about, host failures and making sure that they're placed in different availability zones. Lots of different work required to keep those masters healthy. Now, with AKS, what we've done is we've taken that hosted control plane infrastructure, and Azure is now hosting that on your behalf. And not only does that result in decreased operational burden, you don't have to worry about patching that, upgrades or automated, the scaling of the capacity of that infrastructure is handled by Azure. But you also don't have to pay for the VMs, right? So if you're running 3 VMs, you're no longer having to pay that VM cost. That's cost that's now eaten by Azure. So folks are pretty excited about that, and it's definitely making the AKS offering very attractive to people. Now, actually, before I jump into this, what I want to do is just show you folks a quick demo of what this actually looks like via a live screen share. So let me get my screen sharing infrastructure up. And it looks like I can see this. I'll go ahead and play this video here. And what you can see here is we're going to go ahead and provision and upgrade an AKS cluster from scratch here. So AZ AKS create, I'm going to put it in the resource group AKS, and I'm going to name it my cluster. And I've obviously sped this up. That takes about between 4 and 6 minutes on average. Now that that's returned, I can run AZAKS get credentials with the name of that cluster, and that will suck down a kubectl file for me. And because I have kubectl already installed, I can just type in kubectl get nodes, and boom, we're connected. So for me, it was 2 commands because I already had the client installed. Now, you'll notice that this cluster is running 1.7.7, and I want to run this command now, AZAKS get versions, to show what versions are available, and I'll put that to a table. And you can see here that we have 1.8.1 available as a new version. So what we can do is use this AZAKS upgrade command, pass the name of the cluster and the new version that we want, and this will automatically upgrade the cluster. And again, what we're going to do here is we're going to upgrade the hosted control plane infrastructure first. Then we're going to roll through each of those nodes and do a graceful coordinate drain of each of those nodes. Now you can see, if you look at the timings there of the node counts, you can see it took about 7 or 8 minutes on average to roll through each node. But now we are in fact on 1.8.1, and that occurred with very little downtime. Eventually, it's going to be 0 downtime for those cluster upgrades. Now what we can do is we can actually demonstrate a scale command. I did the AZAKS scale command and put in 10 nodes, and you can see now that we have 10 nodes running, and this operation is actually quite fast. So that's what we have for AKS. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and go ahead and move on to the next thing I want to talk about, which is Kubernetes developer tools. Now, one of the things that we're passionate about at Microsoft is empowering developers, to be able to develop applications faster and easier than ever before. And we want to make sure that we're doing that for Kubernetes as well. Now, the way that we think of this is, Kubernetes, is a really great product and solution for folks who have to worry about IT operations. But for developers, it can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. Developers have to learn things like Docker files, Kubernetes APIs, and there's really opportunity for us to, build tooling to make Kubernetes easier to use, and that's something that we have been investing a lot of resources in. So the first thing that I want to talk about is something called Helm, which is the official package manager for Kubernetes. And this is something that Microsoft engineers are working on every day. And what Helm does is it applies sort of the package management constructs. If you're familiar with Linux package managers like apt or Yum, from Red Hat, it applies the same concept, but to the world of Kubernetes. So you can take Helm and you can use it to install a whole ton of off-the-shelf software. In fact, by a recent count, there's 109 different pieces of off-the-shelf software that's just marked as stable and readily available for you to install into an AKS cluster using Helm. Just simple Helm install stable/Jenkins, and Jenkins is up and running. Now, Helm helps you manage complexity, allows for easily upgrading your Kubernetes applications, rollbacks, things like that. So we're very excited, at what Helm's been able to achieve in terms of making Kubernetes easier to use, and we also have a lot planned for this in the future. Now, the next thing I want to show you is something called Draft. And what Draft does is streamline Kubernetes development. Now, what Draft is targeting is what we refer to in Microsoft as the inner loop. This is the place where developers are hacking on a piece of code, but before they're ready to commit to version control and push that commit up, after which a CI system would typically take over. So what Draft does is it allows developers to develop faster because they don't have to learn things like Docker and Kubernetes concepts. They can use simple scaffolding that's built into Draft to get their app containerized via best practices in a way that's going to be friendly with CI systems. And I am going to show you a demo of this in a moment. The next thing I want to talk about is Brigade. Now, Brigade is something that we just announced, the same day as we announced the new AKS service. This is pretty interesting technology. What this does is it provides an event-based scripting language on top of Kubernetes. So what you can do is you can respond to events and effectively build workflows on top of Kubernetes using JavaScript. So this is a custom JavaScript runtime that we've built that runs on top of Kubernetes, gives you full access to the Kubernetes sort of pods, API model, and you can do things like, fan in, fan out, collect results, and, build lots of interesting control flow logic on top of Kubernetes using the full power of JavaScript. So this is still an alpha. This is brand new, but we have a lot in store with Brigade, as well as tying the three of these projects all together. So here I'd actually want to flip over and show you a demo of what Draft looks like. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Okay, looks like I can see it here. So I'm putting my developer hat on here. I'm a developer and I'm writing a Python application. And this is a very simple application. It's just going to return a hello world. And what I want to do is I'm going to use the draft command and type in draft create. And what draft create is going to do is it's going to scaffold out a bunch of new files into my repo, specifically a Docker file that you can see here, as well as a Helm chart. And this Docker file and Helm chart is going to effectively containerize this application for me, even though I don't, as a developer, I don't actually know anything about Draft. About Kubernetes or Docker. Now we're going to type in the draft up command, and what this does is it ships this working directory of source code up to the Kubernetes cluster, and it will build the Docker images in the cluster. It will push them to our Docker registry that's configured in the cluster, and it will release a version of this app in the cluster that we're hacking on, the active app here. Now, what I can use is the draft connect command to curl to a proxied endpoint, and I can see the Hello World application listening live. So now I can go in and make some changes to the app, make sure that this is tuned up the way that I want it. And every time I make a change, I just type in draft up and create another tunnel with draft connect, and I can access those changes live. Once I'm done and I'm happy with my application, in sort of this dev sandbox environment, I can commit those changes to version control, push them up to sort of my source of truth, be that GitHub or VSTS or wherever, and CI can take over and get that deployed out to production. As you can see here, we're using Draft Connect again, and when we curl this, we should now see hello draft returned. So we can see that this is all wired up. Now, this is incredibly powerful because there's a lot of folks out there who are interested in deploying to Kubernetes, but don't have the interest in sitting down and learning things like Docker files, Kubernetes manifests, the APIs. There's a lot of stuff that developers, who typically just want to write code and deploy it, they don't want to have to do. So Draft is a very empowering tool, and we're excited to offer this up to the community as an easy way to get onboarded into the world of Kubernetes. So that was all I wanted to share, and in fact, I believe that is all I had for you today. Here is a slide with some resources and some next steps, some links that you can check out. The AKS service is in preview today. We actually just announced a few new regions. We're live in East US and in West Europe, as of just the last few days. So feel free to check that out. We look forward to your feedback on that. And with that,